Two backyards can be the same size and still produce very different amounts of food. One large plant might take over a section of ground for months, while a climbing crop may need only a narrow strip of soil and use the space above it. Another crop might be harvested in just a few weeks, leaving that same spot open for something else. In this video, we're looking at 10 food crops that are especially useful when backyard space is limited, along with practical ways to make better use of each one without expanding the size of your garden. Number 10. Blueberries. A small backyard doesn't mean you have to grow only annual vegetables. If your climate is suitable, a blueberry bush can turn one large container into a productive fruit-growing space for years. One advantage of blueberries is that they don't necessarily need to take up valuable ground in the garden. Some varieties stay relatively compact and are well suited to containers, patios, and smaller spaces around the house. Containers can actually be helpful with blueberries because these plants prefer acidic soil. If your native soil isn't naturally acidic enough, it can be much easier to control the growing mix in one large pot than to change the soil across an entire section of the yard. Give blueberries plenty of sun. In very hot climates, some afternoon protection may be useful depending on the variety and local conditions. Moisture also needs to stay fairly consistent because blueberry roots are relatively shallow, and a container that dries out too quickly can make it difficult for the plant to perform well. Before buying a plant, check the variety carefully. Different blueberries have very different winter chill requirements, so a variety that performs well in the north may not be the right choice for a warm southern climate. Some varieties also produce better when another compatible blueberry is nearby for cross-pollination. Blueberries aren't the simplest crop on this list, but with the right variety and the right conditions, one container in a corner of the yard can provide fruit for years without taking over the space you use for annual vegetables. Number 9. Strawberries. Strawberries are useful in a small backyard, not because one plant produces a huge amount of food, but because they can fit into places where larger crops simply can't. They can grow along the edge of a bed, in containers, planters, hanging baskets, or small spaces next to a patio where a large tomato plant or sprawling squash would never fit comfortably. If you grow strawberries in a garden bed, consider using the edge instead of giving them the center of the bed. In containers, use enough soil volume that the roots don't dry out constantly. Strawberries still need good sunlight for strong fruit production, and consistent moisture becomes especially important while the plants are flowering and developing berries. It also helps to know what type of strawberry you're planting. Some types produce a lot of runners and new daughter plants. That can be useful if you want to propagate them, but in a very small space, those runners can also spread quickly into neighboring areas. If your goal is to keep things compact, trim unwanted runners or guide them into small pots so they can root where you want them. Strawberries don't need to fill an entire small garden. Their real advantage is that they can produce food in spaces that many larger crops cannot use efficiently. Number 8. Basil. If you only have a few small containers near the kitchen door, basil is one of the easiest ways to make that space productive. A basil plant doesn't need a huge footprint. It grows well in containers, and you can harvest the tender tips and leaves again and again throughout the warm season. Instead of allowing the plant to grow tall and flower early, regularly cut the growing tips just above a pair of leaves. That encourages branching and gives you more fresh growth to harvest later. Basil loves warm weather, and it does not tolerate frost. Don't rush it outside just because the afternoons feel warm if the nights are still cold. Once the weather is consistently warm, basil can grow very quickly with enough sunlight, well-drained soil, and regular moisture. In a small backyard, basil also doesn't need the best position in the middle of the vegetable garden. A container on a patio, step, deck, or sunny spot next to the house can work perfectly well. Just remember that small pots can dry out quickly during summer. The value of basil is simple. It takes up very little space, works well in containers, and can be harvested repeatedly instead of giving you one harvest and then disappearing. Number 7. Beets. Beets use space efficiently because most of the main harvest develops below ground, while the leaves above the soil don't form a huge plant. And the root isn't the only edible part. Young beet greens can also be harvested and eaten. You can take a small number of leaves while the plants are developing, although you don't want to remove too many if you still want the roots to size up properly. Even seedlings removed during thinning don't necessarily have to go to waste. The young greens are edible too. Beets generally prefer cooler conditions rather than the hottest part of summer. In many parts of the United States, they fit well into spring and fall planting windows. That gives them another advantage in a small garden. The same patch of ground can grow beets during cool weather and then be turned over to a warm season crop once the beets are harvested. One thing to remember when planting is that what looks like a single beet seed can actually produce more than one seedling. That means thinning is often necessary so the remaining plants have enough room to develop good roots. Beets don't earn their space because one plant produces dozens of vegetables. They earn it because they stay relatively compact, give you both edible greens and roots, and fit easily into a garden that changes crops with the seasons. Number 6. Carrots. Carrots are a good example of using the depth of the soil instead of taking up a lot of space above ground. The plant has relatively modest foliage compared with many fruiting vegetables, while the main harvest develops below the surface. If you're growing carrots in containers or shallow beds, shorter varieties can be especially useful because they don't require as much soil depth as long-rooted types. The biggest challenge with carrots usually isn't space, it's soil quality. Rocky, compacted, or clumpy soil can cause roots to fork or become misshapen. In a small garden, a container or a section of bed filled with loose, stone-free soil can make carrots much easier to grow successfully. Sow carrots directly where you want them to grow. They don't like being transplanted once the root system has started developing. And once the seedlings come up, thin them properly. Trying to save every single plant by leaving them crowded together usually gives you a lot of tiny carrots instead of more food. Once carrots are harvested, the space is completely open again. That makes them useful in a small garden where the same patch of soil may be planted several times during the year instead of being occupied by one crop for the entire season. Number 5. Radishes. If carrots make good use of soil depth, radishes earn their place because of speed. Many radish varieties can go from seed to harvest much faster than most warm-season vegetables. That means a small patch of soil doesn't have to be dedicated to them for months. In areas with cool spring weather, you can sow radishes early, harvest them before your main summer crops need all the available space, and then plant something else in exactly the same spot. And when late summer begins to cool down, many gardeners can grow another radish crop for fall. That matters in a small backyard because garden space isn't just about length and width. How long a crop occupies that space matters too. Radishes prefer cooler growing conditions. If the weather becomes too hot, root quality can decline and the plants may bolt. So there's no advantage in forcing them through the hottest part of summer just to keep the soil occupied. The young leaves are edible as well, and seedlings removed during thinning can also be used instead of thrown away. Radishes earn their space because they grow quickly, leave quickly, and allow the same piece of ground to produce more than one crop during the year. Number 4. Sugar snap peas. A trellis in a small backyard doesn't have to sit unused until summer. Sugar snap peas are one way to put that vertical space to work during cool weather. Taller climbing varieties can grow upward on a trellis instead of spreading across the ground, and the young pods are harvested and eaten whole. Picking regularly can keep the plants producing while conditions remain favorable. Peas don't like prolonged heat. In many climates, they are an early season crop. Once warmer weather arrives and the plants begin to decline, you can remove them and give the exact same trellis to a warm season climber. That's what makes sugar snap peas especially useful in a small garden. You don't need a different structure for every season. One vertical growing area can support peas in cool weather and another crop later in the year. When choosing a variety, check its mature height. Some peas stay quite short and barely need support, while taller climbing varieties are much better if your goal is to make full use of vertical space. And even though peas prefer cool weather, they still need good light and consistent moisture to produce well. Cool season does not mean shade-loving. Number 3. Peppers. A pepper plant can occupy a fairly small area and still continue producing fruit for weeks or even months when the weather is right. That makes peppers especially useful for container growing. You don't need an entire garden bed for a few plants. A large enough pot in a sunny corner of a patio or backyard can support a productive pepper plant without taking much ground space. Hot pepper varieties can be particularly useful in small gardens because many stay relatively compact while producing a large number of fruits. But not every pepper plant stays small. Some varieties can become fairly large, so check the mature size before deciding how many plants to squeeze into one area. Peppers love warm conditions. Planting them too early into cold soil usually doesn't give you an earlier harvest. The plants may simply sit there and grow slowly until the weather improves. Once fruit begins developing, consistent watering becomes important. And if you're growing peppers in containers, remember that a small pot sitting in full summer sun can dry out very quickly. Saving space doesn't mean forcing the plant to survive in the smallest possible amount of soil. A few healthy pepper plants with enough root room and enough light are usually more useful than a crowded group of stressed plants. Number 2. Cherry tomatoes. Tomatoes can become some of the biggest space users in the garden if they're allowed to spread freely. But choosing the right growth habit and training the plant vertically can change that dramatically. For a small backyard, indeterminate cherry tomato varieties are especially useful because they continue extending their stems and producing new flower clusters as long as conditions remain favorable. With stakes, strings, or a strong trellis, much of that growth can be directed upward instead of spreading across pathways and neighboring plants. That allows one well-supported cherry tomato plant to produce cluster after cluster of fruit through a long growing season without requiring the same amount of horizontal space as an unmanaged plant. But vertical growing does not mean tomatoes need very little soil. They still develop a large root system and need regular water and nutrients. If you grow them in containers, give them enough soil volume. A tiny container may look space-efficient at the beginning of the season, but by midsummer, it can become difficult to keep watered and fed properly. And in regions where both daytime and nighttime temperatures become extremely high, tomatoes can still slow down fruit set during the hottest part of summer. A trellis does not remove that biological limitation. What makes cherry tomatoes useful in a small backyard is the combination of vertical growth, a long harvest period, and many clusters of fruit from a single, well-managed plant. Number 1. Pole beans. If I had to choose one crop that clearly demonstrates how to make better use of a small growing space, pole beans would be difficult to beat. At ground level, they only need a fairly narrow planting strip. From there, the vines climb upward on strings, netting, poles, or a trellis, turning the open space above the garden into productive growing area. The pods are also relatively light, so the support system doesn't have to carry the kind of weight you would expect from large melons or winter squash. A simple but sturdy trellis can support an entire row. Once the beans begin producing, pick the pods while they're still young and tender, instead of leaving them on the vines until they become old and tough. Regular harvesting also encourages the plants to keep producing while growing conditions remain favorable. Pole beans are warm season plants, so wait until the soil and weather have warmed before planting. They prefer full sun, and even though established plants can handle short dry periods, regular moisture is still important when they are flowering and developing pods. Another advantage is that a bean trellis can fit along the edge of a garden, beside a narrow planting area, or anywhere you have vertical space but not enough room for a sprawling crop. If your goal is to grow more food without making the backyard larger, this is exactly the kind of crop that makes sense. A relatively small footprint at ground level, with most of the plant working above it. If your backyard is small, there are 3 practical things worth checking before deciding whether a crop deserves space. First, can it use vertical space? Pole beans, climbing peas, and properly trained tomatoes can produce a lot of growth above a relatively narrow planting area. Second, how long will it occupy that spot? Radishes, carrots, and beets can be harvested and replaced by another crop instead of staying in the ground for the entire growing season. And third, does it really need garden soil, or can it grow somewhere else? Basil, peppers, strawberries, and some blueberries can use containers, patios, edges, and small spaces that may not work well for a traditional vegetable bed. If you're gardening in a limited space, Tell us which crop gives you the most value for the space it takes up, and what part of the country you're growing in. Subscribe for practical food gardening ideas built around real backyards, real weather, limited space, and the growing conditions you actually have. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next garden.